We are also recording the session, as you can see. And we also have the live transcript available to those of you who would like to avail yourselves of that. In just a second, I'm going to turn things over to Lsna Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education, Tim Mckay, who's going to set the stage for this conversation. And then I will be back to introduce the panelists and to get that part of the program started. So Tim.
All right, great. Thanks very much, Deb, for getting this started. We've learned so many things this year, including as I watched the live transcript, we have learned that LS and A gets translated as Ellison A, which is delightful in its way. I want to start first with some gratitude. This semester has been incredibly challenging, of course, for all of us. And as we bring it to a close, I want to offer my personal thanks to everybody, the faculty, the staff, students, everyone who's been working to keep Lsna's educational mission working forward. I know personally and from my interactions with all of you that the work required to do this was way higher than it is in normal times. Plus, the circumstances in which you've done all this work have made the task even harder. I want to especially thank the leadership and staff at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching and Lsna Technology Services team for everything they've done to help us survive the last year, but also and perhaps especially for arranging today's faculty panel. And I want to remind you that there will be a second offering. Another panel of faculty members will speak on Monday at 12:30 on related topics. There's so much going on now and so many things that we need to learn from one another that we wanted to offer at least a few opportunities to do that. I'm so pleased and relieved that recent developments have started to give us hope that we might emerge from the pandemic during the coming year. I don't know about you, but for me, this is very restorative news. It leaves me feeling like as we begin the new year, I can go into it with an energy that has been difficult to muster over the last months. We're looking for ways, a bunch of different ways as we get ready for that, to share with you reflections and guidance about teaching in the winter term, which will remain a mostly remote environment, in fact, an even more remote environment than what we had in the fall. And the advice that we want to share is based on what we've learned as a community in the fall. And again, the community here is everybody. It's not just faculty, it's not just our teaching experts at places like CRLT and Lsna Technology Services. It's every faculty member, every staff member has learned things. Every student has learned things, and students are providing a lot of the most important feedback to us on what's working in teaching and learning. Furthermore, this is a crisis that, of course, is not just ours, but it belongs to the planet. And so there's an emerging scholarly conversation about teaching and learning during the pandemic and what we're getting for it. We're going to try to filter all that stuff forward and help to share that with you. A lot of our advice is also gleaned from winter planning surveys that were sent to students and faculty and staff in October as we were thinking about what we might do in the winter term. There's lots of insights in all of those surveys, and many of the results of them were published for the campus community as part of the winter planning process. If you go to the university's website for the winter plan, you can find all those reports there. I would encourage all of you who are instructors, especially to spend a little time with the report from students, because the student issues that are raised are really interesting and important. They're not all surprises, but it's valuable to look and to weigh for yourself where we are on facing these particular challenges. And when you do that, I would encourage you to take a step beyond the normal thing of looking at a survey, where maybe the thing you focus on is the average answer of the students. So just to give you one example, there's a question that asks the students about their ability to access remote course materials. And in the summary that you would read here, it would say that over 70% of the students had no trouble accessing course materials. But it left out the fact that 27% of students found accessing course materials either somewhat or very difficult. And 5% of our students found it very difficult. And 5% may not sound like much, but if you're teaching a course that's like a big introductory physics course, that 5% may be 40 or 50 people who are really struggling with access to course materials. Anyway, so try to, as you look at that, think about going beyond the basics. What are some of the key issues that students raise, though? The first, maybe most important, is the connection with instructors and with one another were both important to them and difficult to accomplish in the fall. So thinking about ways in which we can connect with students is really essential. I'm sure that many of our panelists will speak about this. As a result, in fact, students struggled with motivation and with organization and with their sense of belonging in the class. So thinking about how you can support students staying on track and being organized and feeling like they really are part of the course is important. Probably the most widespread perception among both students and faculty this year is that the workload of doing these online courses is much higher than either they have experienced in the past or than they expected in these classes. This is a subtle, complex question. I know that many of us felt as instructors we were not asking for more than we had in the past, and yet it often was perceived that way by students. And I think there are good, solid reasons to explain why that is. Perhaps our panelists will talk about it a bit. And I would say, for me, the most distressing thing that I found in the student surveys was a sense among students that while they belong to the University of Michigan, they feel part of the University of Michigan, they sometimes felt like they're not valued as individuals. And even sometimes, like, faculty members didn't value them as individuals. And I don't believe that that's really true, but that perception was easier to get this term. And so working on that feels important to me. So our big goal is that we would try to address these terms with refinements to our courses for the winter term, and that's what we're here to help with. Beyond that kind of basic advice we're providing here, CRLT and Lsna Technology Services, all kinds of great information that I'm sure they will be sharing with you and as we come out of this. And so with that introduction, I'm going to turn things back over to Deb, who's going to introduce our panelists and get things going.
Thanks, Tim. So now we're going to turn to the panel. Delighted to have this group of 4 faculty who have agreed to reflect on their experiences, how they approached their courses this fall, with particular attention to issues of student engagement and community, and hopefully some remarks about how they address workload issues as well. So I want to welcome Meg Duffy from biology, specifically ecology and evolutionary biology, Katherine Brown from comparative literature and the residential college, Chuck Shippen from political science, and Daniel Weissman from psychology. We're going to move alphabetically by discipline. And so I would like to turn things over to Meg Duffy to get us started.
Okay, and that's good timing because I just convinced my 4-year-old that he should go back downstairs. We'll see how long I have before he reappears. So thank you for the invitation to speak here. I think I have learned a lot over the course of this semester, and I'm hoping it will be useful to other people. So as Deb said, I'm a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology. I teach biology 171. So intro bio lecture is split across 2 lecture courses, 171 and 172. I teach 171, which is the ecology and evolutionary biology and genetics portion of the course. We generally have enrollments of about 600 students or maybe a little under. So it's a large lecture course. And so we were asked to tell you about what we did this semester, but I realized that in order to do that, it would help if I told you what we did last year. So to sort of contrast somewhat. And then I realized if I tried to just say all of that, it would be totally confusing. So I am going to share my screen. And actually, I'm going to use basically the same approach that I use when I'm teaching. So I have my iPad connected with slides that I can annotate. So this is the approach I used for teaching this semester. So I already introduced the course. So as I said, I'll tell you first about what we did, the way the course was structured last year. So it's a highly structured course. It's a fast-paced course. Last year, we had 2 lectures a week, 80 minutes each, and they were traditional lecturing mixed with active learning. So I wasn't just talking at the students for 80 minutes, but I was talking at the students a fair amount. But then they would also have clicker questions and other in-class activities that they would do. On top of those 2 80-minute lectures a week, there was a discussion section that was also 80 minutes a week. That was taught by GSIs or UTAs, and that gave them practice with lecture material, but also extended lecture material. They also had 2 quizzes a week to try to promote staying on top of the material. They had 4 exams over the course of the semester. We did clickers in class and there were points associated with them, but factored in a way where we only included them if they helped the student grade. So they were optional, but for most students, they helped them and they were incredibly motivated to get those points. And then normally I wouldn't have included this as part of the course structure, but it'll become clear why I have it here in a minute. We would have 1 exam review session prior to each exam. For some of the students, it would come, an hour and a half before the exam or something like that. And that's where we would work through some of the more challenging problems that have been on the practice exams. So this year, what we did was we moved to a fully flipped model. So I took the recordings, so we've recorded our lectures with lecture capture for many semesters. So I went back and took those recordings and I split them up into chunks. I cut whatever I could. Maternal inheritance, it was gone, right? So various things that I thought weren't as essential got cut for this semester. One advantage of doing that was it was still very time intensive, but it took less time than recording fully new lectures. And the other reason I did it was then I could leave in the student questions. So for privacy reasons, I would actually take out the sound of the student asking it, but because it was such a big lecture, I would always repeat what the question was and then answer it. And students told me they did really like having that part in the pre-recorded lectures, that they could hear the questions that students asked when they first heard the material. We still had the discussion section, but we more than halved the amount of material that we covered in that. And so we really just focused on practicing lecture material and not extending lecture material. We shifted to just 1 quiz a week. And one reason why we did that is we moved to 6 exams over the course of the semester. And I'll come back to that more. The students actually really liked that. I did still use clickers during active learning sessions, but they were totally optional. And maybe half the students on an active learning session would use the clickers. And so one of the big changes, and one of the ones I wanted to highlight, are these active learning sessions that we had. So in many ways, they were similar to an exam review session, but there were 1 or 2 of them per week, depending on whether we had an exam. So we worked through more challenging questions, generally former exam questions, or we would organize the information. So make a table comparing and contrasting genetic drift and gene flow. And for some students, so the first one of those was the first Wednesday of the semester, and some heads clearly exploded, but that was 2 weeks before their first exam. And I think the students really, really loved the active learning sessions. So these were, to go into them more, they were synchronous but recorded, and participation was not required, and it wasn't even like sort of required the way we used to with in-class lecture attendance by giving them these optional points. We didn't do that because we knew we were going to have students participating from Asia and who would have a lot going on, and we were trying to offer as much flexibility as we could. So I would say that maybe about half of the students would, and that number dropped over time. At the beginning of the semester, maybe about half of the students would participate synchronously. Some of them would watch them asynchronously later, and I know some of them just weren't engaging with the active learning sessions. I already mentioned what we did during them, but we also, what I really was concerned about was my favorite moment in a lecture would be when I'd ask a student ask clicker questions and they'd turn and talk to each other and they'd start like pointing at the board and drawing graphs with their hands, and that peer learning that happened. So I wanted to try to approximate that. I tested out a variety of different things over the summer. None of them were picked, but the one that I thought was best and that we ended up using were Google Chats. And so each GSI set up a GChat for their discussion sections. And that was a way for them to have a back channel and to do some peer instruction during the course of the active learning session. And then because the class is so big, I ran the active learning session as a webinar. So there was a Q&A, and sometimes I would open the chat. So it's sort of a mixture of things. I think it worked really well. I think I'm planning on keeping this flipped model. I think in going to the workload, well, the workload of making all of the videos was enormous. But now that we have those, we can take advantage of that even once we're back to being in a lecture hall. But I actually, even if we're back in a lecture hall, I would want to keep some of like a Zoom Q&A. I actually had more interactions with more students over the course of the semester than I would in a typical semester, because with, you know, in the auditorium, it takes a very brave student to raise their hand and, you know, ask a question about what was going on. Whereas in the Zoom Q&A, I would get questions from, you know, 40 students over the course of an active learning session. Just many more students were asking questions. They would answer each other's questions. And then one other thing that I wanted to note is this trade-off, and I think this is starting to be discussed a little more, and it links to something that Tim was saying. So some students really did need the flexibility of the asynchronous, having fully asynchronous options for this course. But the problem is that removed structure. And as Tim said, some students were struggling with organization. And I think it's possible that actually more students struggled because of the lack of structure by us allowing for everything to be done fully asynchronously with no questions asked. And so for this year, for this winter, I would find that a really hard decision to make. By the time we're back to next fall, even if our big classes are in person, I think I would still want to, I would try to swing the pendulum back a little more towards less, be as flexible as you want, to having more structure. So I think that's a trade-off that is important to think about. And then I'll just end by briefly mentioning, I said that we switched to doing 6 exams instead of 4, and students absolutely, it surprised me. They really, at the beginning of the semester, they mostly actually seemed on board with it. And even after slogging through 5 exams, which came 2 weeks apart, so it was quite a slog for me, the students actually still were in favor of having more exams. I write for a blog, and if you want to read more about this, I made it a shorter URL. I guess I could put that link in the chat in a minute. So that's my summary of what we changed and how things went this semester.
Thanks so much, Meg. Speaking of your sort of comments about questions and back channels and chats, please feel free to all of you who are on the call, there's many folks here, that if you have questions for our panelists, to go ahead and put those in the chat. We will specifically move to Q&A after everybody has had a chance to talk, but my colleague Matt Kaplan and Moni Dressler are here, and they're going to be sort of pulling questions from the chat, and they will be prioritizing sort of meatier questions, I don't know how that's going to show up on the transcript there, to pose back to the panelists when we move to the Q&A. But there may be questions that you have that that other folks may jump in and answer as we're going along, or resources that are provided, and we're happy to use the chat in that way, even though we know it can be hard to monitor like 5 different things at once. So, but I just wanted to note that. And now I'd like to turn things over to Katherine Brown to speak a little bit about her experience with her courses in the residential college in comparative literature.
Okay, so I should say right off that my response to fall semester was both shaped and made possible by the kind of teaching that I do, which is small humanities classes, this term conducted ultimately over Zoom. In these small seminars, I have absolute freedom to design all aspects of the class. Not everybody on this meeting will have that freedom or the conditions that I'm teaching under, but I'm hoping that there might be something useful here for you in what I learned this past semester in these classes. And the core of what I learned isn't a set of tech tools, but it's rather an attitude adjustment. So let me just frame it up for you by saying it was clear to all of us, and really clear to me coming into the term, that the pandemic, the social unrest of the summer, and the election were going to mean that for reasons both practical and ethical, there would have to be changes in both the structure of my classes and my attitude toward them. The university was quite forthcoming and very helpful on the practical support and the tech tools, but the attitude was something that I had to adjust myself. In a normal semester, I think, for most of us anyway, the working assumption is that our class is or should be as important to the students as it is to us. This is seldom true, but under normal conditions, it's easy to proceed as if it were and deal with the attendant frustrations. This semester put that in my face and forced me to set it aside. It was clear to me that the most important thing for students this semester was simply getting through it. So I tried as a result to do everything that I could to make my classes be not part of a problem, but part of the support system. So that meant that I needed to set aside a lot of cherished, let's call them content-oriented goals. It seemed to me that it wouldn't be fair to assume that my students would be able to focus on reading and writing in the same way that they would in an ordinary semester. So that meant that I had to set aside my attachment to things I called content-oriented goals, like the finer points of Augustine's Confessions or effective structure of an introductory paragraph. I had to set those things aside. And the result was a kind of a pedagogical, what occurred to me as I was writing up these notes, a kind of pedagogical humility, that it had to be fine with me if the class was really just a reading group that the students liked going to and that showed them constructive things that they could do with their minds and their imaginations. So having made that attitude adjustment, I focused my course design on trying to offer the closest thing I could to community in this totally weird virtual form. To try to model how mutual respect, creativity, and intellectual play could sustain us in a time of deep national, international, and personal crisis. So the first step toward that, or at least a step toward that, was transparency. Being clear to the students, here's what I'm doing, and here's why I'm doing it. So in August, I spent some time on the interwebs and looking at what other colleagues and other universities were doing in response to it. And I found this very inspiring text by a professor at Northwestern. And he was putting on his class website something that he calls a COVID caveat. And I'm going to put a link in the chat to my version of it. There it is. I borrowed language from his statement and credited him on my remark. I've made this page be the landing page for my Canvas, that landing Canvas page for both of my courses. You now have the link so you can read the whole thing. I'm just going to read you a little bit of it. We're all doing our best to learn together during an extraordinarily difficult time. We're working in new ways and in unusual environments. We're caring for others and trying to keep ourselves healthy, sheltered, fed, and sane. We're worried all the time, and some of us are dealing with fear and loss. And there's an election coming up about which many, if not all of us, have strong and passionate feelings. All of this said, I believe there's a point to what we're doing here. There's a point to building community in new ways with people you just met. There's a point to thinking, reading, and writing together, to working to be the best writers, thinkers, and readers that we can be, and urging each other to write think, and read more attentively, more rigorously, more creatively, more joyfully. I will operate from the assumption that each of us is here in good faith, that each one of us is curious, engaged, and eager to do the best work that they can. Taking all of that as a given, I also want you to know that your health, both physical and mental, is always more important to me than this class. My primary role as a teacher is to support your intellectual and creative growth however I can. Supporting your intellectual and creative growth also means supporting your mental and physical health. I learned today that the U of M has released a syllabus, suggested syllabus statement language for our syllabi on student well-being. I just want to say not in passing, I want to say, since I have this opportunity, that syllabus statements have to be supported by the ethos of the instructor and the design of the course. Just putting that statement on the syllabus. That's a good first step, but at least to me, it seemed to me like I had to take the challenge, the ethical and pedagogical challenge, all the way down to the root of the course. So community became the main thing. My attitude adjusted goal then was to create conditions in which community and its nourishment would happen. So now I'm going to turn very briefly to those procedures. I see I have a couple minutes left. Procedures and tech tools. So I instituted some changes of procedure and method, and I'd be happy to talk about these in more detail if anybody wants to. Instead of using Canvas, I moved a lot of group discussion to Slack. It's right there on their phone. It's much closer to their physical and mental habits than using Canvas is. It's much faster, and it's much less school feeling. So conversation about the class, posts about the reading, announcements, communication with me was all moved to Slack. That was extremely successful, I think. The next step I took was community note-taking on Drive. So in every class, I assigned a pair of students to take notes of the class discussion on in a dedicated folder on a shared Google Drive, so that both students felt that they had some ownership in the class and some responsibility for the class as well. I also shifted the class, and perhaps the most radical change was shifting the class to self-assessment. So removing the pressure of the grade, asking students at the beginning of the semester to set their own goals and then measure how well they achieve them, with feedback from me and from their classmates. I reserve the right, and I told them this up front in writing, to change any final grade they assign if my experience shows me that there's been injustice done in any way. The final part of those new methods was collaborative writing feedback. So students would write a short essay, share it on a Google Drive with writing teams, which I created in advance. And then those writing teams would comment on each other's papers. I would then comment on each one of the papers, and I rotated the teams throughout the semester. So finally, community really was the main thing I was trying to create. It became the center of all of my efforts. I know that it worked in one class. I think it worked in another. But the thing that I really know is that the work with pedagogical attitude that I started with has been deeply transformative for me as a person and as a teacher. And I've learned a great deal from this semester, and I'm very grateful for it. That's what I got.
Thanks, Katherine, and thanks for highlighting all the different ways in which you attended to community in this particular moment. So now we're going to move to Chuck Shippen from Political Science. And so, Chuck, go ahead. I lost you. I don't see you. How about if we jump over to Daniel in psychology, and then we will come back around. I'm not sure what happened.
Okay, I assume you can hear me.
Yep, we're good.
Okay, great. So I'm Daniel from psychology, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Psychology 302, which is a research methods course for about 120 students in psychology that has a weekly lecture and a weekly lab section. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the choice between I guess, synchronous and asynchronous, as well as engaging students. And I went primarily synchronous for everything. All lab sections, all lectures were synchronous. In part because I wanted to make sure the workload didn't increase for students. So I thought if I had them watch videos and then maybe do something else in class, that would be extra time. But also to really keep them engaged. I had heard from various students that, I guess from last winter when the pandemic first started, that they would fall behind and kind of not watch the asynchronous videos for a while. And so I really wanted to keep them engaged. I'll get to that more of that in a moment, but I started the class with an introductory survey that I sent before the semester started. And the students could fill out their name and any pronouns or pronunciations that they wanted. I would ask them things like, and it's kind of funny texty thing that looked really high school-y. I would ask them things like, okay, where will you be? In Ann Arbor, somewhere else. And this was to kind of make any special accommodations I might need for people in different time zones. I asked about whether they'd have reliable internet connections, what lab section they were in. And there were a number of these sorts of questions, but what was really cool was that with this last question, is there anything else you would like me to know about you? And students really put a lot of stuff in there, like, my pet Fluffy is, blah, blah, blah. And I think this was, evidence that they just wanted to reach out and have some social contact. So it's a good way to get to know your students. And I found that was a good way to start out. And for every student who filled out that last box with something personal, I wrote an email to them before the start of the semester. And there were a large number of emails I had to write. But I think that also helped them to feel like they were getting to know me. The other thing I tried to do to keep them engaged, or another thing, was to make a Canvas site that is really, really easy to navigate. And for this, I attended many ITCS trainings and psychology department trainings, so I got a lot of help. But the idea was to adopt a kind of modular structure. So in the beginning, I had some introductions from myself. So if you click on this page, which I hope you can see, you'll see that there's actually a video of me that you can click on, and that's me for 2 minutes talking about myself and my background and some funny things about me. In addition, I introduced how can you ask questions. We used Piazza, which I would highly recommend. It's a Q&A for large classes, and students can ask questions and they can see each other's questions, they can answer each other's questions, I can answer their questions. So it's a great way to very efficiently address lots of questions. I provided descriptions of the major assignments in the course, like the article summary, research report, et cetera, et cetera. And if you click on these, it'll actually go in and say exactly what's required. And I have links to PDFs that are relevant and like rubrics, how they'll be graded, et cetera, even examples. So the attempt here was to make it very easy for for students to access all the materials they would need to complete each assignment, even though we went over those in class as well. And then I had a weekly structure, so they would have a lecture, and there was some prep work, like some readings maybe. And so I would say, hi, everybody, please read this chapter. And you can just click on this and it goes right to the chapter. So it's really easy for students to access all the materials because they just click and they're right there. Following the prep work, the structure was kind of stayed constant across the semester, but there would be a quiz on Canvas that they would have to take with 5 questions about the reading or whatever the prep work was. Sometimes it was a video. Then I would post my slides typically right before the lecture so they couldn't use them to study for the quiz. The quiz would remain open for about almost 2 days before the lecture, so they had lots of time. I would usually upload the slides in both PowerPoint and PDF format, maybe not for that first lecture, but some students don't have PowerPoint. After the lecture on Zoom, I would post the recording, so students who prefer to watch asynchronously or who missed it could do so. Then there was the same structure of prep work for Lab 1, so if there was any reading they would need to do or a video, they would do that. And then they would actually have some activities in Lab 1. So for example, this would describe some videos that they had to watch or something. In this case, this was during the strike actually. So I actually created very quickly some videos for the students to watch because the GSIs weren't able to attend that one. And then I would post reminders of anything that was due. So this was an assignment that would be due in this first week or something like that. And what the students said they appreciated a lot was the fact that there were lots of, this structure would repeat across weeks. So there's always prep work for the lecture, a quiz, I post the slides, I post a video, and then whatever prep work there is for the next lab. And that just repeats throughout the semester. After the 7th week, the students had a midterm exam in the 8th week. And I did the same thing that some others have described for the exam. So I wrote questions, most of them in an application type way, but some ones that were just checking, did they do readings, did they attend lectures, and others that were a little more thoughtful. I did it kind of that they could backtrack and see all the questions, but also there was a time limit of 60 minutes. It was open book, so they could check everything. We didn't monitor with cameras. We just asked them not to talk to each other, but we said they could create a study guide. I gave them extra credit for creating their own study guide. And I found that, at least for the midterm, with a 60-minute time limit for 50 multiple choice questions, the distribution of grades was pretty much the same as it was in a regular semester, because it's just really hard to look everything up. And I shuffle the order of the answers as well as the order of the questions across students, so it's really hard for them to collaborate. So I think the Canvas site hopefully was helpful to them. I also learned a lot about Zoom, which I'm sure all of us did, but I made polls for every lecture. The students love these polls. They're like, ask me more questions. Sometimes, you know, in class, they ask me questions. I use the chat function. They raise their hands. I call on them. Even with 120 students, it works like a seminar. They just ask me, I pause, I say, who has a question. But I also do these polls, and they love them, just like the quiz questions, to test their knowledge. I also gave them time, both in lecture and in lab section, to go in breakout rooms. Like whenever they didn't agree on a poll question, for example, in lecture, I'd say, let's go into a breakout room with 4 or 5 students, talk about it for a minute, and then we'll vote again. I'll poll you again. We'll see if we get closer to the right answer. And if they didn't, I would explain what the right answer was. But that provided some social interaction time. Let's see. I also, very important, gave them a sort of midterm student feedback questionnaire about 3 or 4 weeks into the semester. And I asked them questions about, like, what's going well in the course? Like, what helps you learn? And I also said, what would you recommend changing? And I've taught this course many times, but I never really did it online before, and this actually was very helpful. The students had lots of suggestions for how I could change things, and I did. I actually wrote an announcement to the class after this, and I said, hey, you had lots of great suggestions. I'm just gonna basically do all of them. And I think the students appreciated that, and so I would highly recommend that. That also kind of made them feel included in the decision-making process, and I think, more engaged and feeling like I was recognizing their needs. Other things I did ranged, but here's one example of our Thanksgiving Jamberry board. And this was just something I posted and said around Thanksgiving, and I said, hey, what are we all grateful for? It's been a hard semester. And so students could post if they wanted to, just completely voluntarily. This is me with my dog, Winston. But people could voluntarily post what they were grateful for, or things like this. And I think this helped a lot to increase the feeling of community in the class. I'm not sure if I've left anything out, but important. I think the workload that I shot for was pretty much the same as a normal semester, I will say that. Some of the lab exercises we couldn't do because it's not easy to do certain things online, like, you know, in MATLAB or other kind of programs. But for the most part, I think we tried to shoot for the same overall workload. So So I think that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Daniel. Super, and particularly for sharing some of the images of the organizational structure that you were using and how you made the sort of structure that you decided on so transparent and apparent to students. So we're going to switch back to Chuck, whose internet has mercifully returned. I think every one of these sessions highlights exactly what we all are dealing with and what our students are dealing with. And so Chuck, thanks for making it back, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks. That wasn't even a plant that, let's show what can happen when technology goes out. So my name is Chuck Shippen, and I teach in the Department of Political Science. The course that I taught this past semester is the Intro to American Politics class, which, yep, it was every bit as eventful as you might think it might have been during this past semester. It's mostly first and second year students who take this course. And there were about, I think, 215 students in the course. So I wanted to start my comments now by giving a sort of broad overview of the structure of the course. And then I want to focus in on three things that I tried that worked pretty well, that as a result, I would recommend. They were lessons that I learned during the semester. So in terms of the structure, the course was a mixture of asynchronous and synchronous components. And the reason I did it that way is that both of them seemed useful, but in different ways. And so what I did was I wanted to have some lecture because there's just something that I had to get across in lecture, but I didn't see the need to do that synchronously. But I also wanted time to engage with the students, and that required having a synchronous component. So what I did was I recorded some short lectures, emphasis on short, about 15 to 20 minutes each. And I would post 2 of those per week. This was for students to watch in advance. So what it meant is I took the lectures that I had been doing when I've taught this course in the past, and I really had to distill them down to their main components and focus in on those. The students were expected to watch those in class, ahead of class, and then we would turn to them in class. The in-class portion then, since they were already doing some of the work that we would normally cover in class, ended up being shorter. We didn't meet for the full hour and a half twice a week like we normally would. And in that in-portion part of the class, I ended up doing a variety of activities. And this was a very intentional decision and something that came about from talking to different people during the summer about how to do it. So one thing I did is I had a number of guests come in, different scholars who study different components of political science. I did breakout room discussions. I allowed time for questions, and I had a little bit of lecture. I tried not to do a lot of lecture in this synchronous component, but there were always some things that didn't make it into the distilled version of the pre-recorded lectures. And in addition, I also wanted to make my lectures timeless. So I didn't want to make a reference to yesterday's Supreme Court decision in the pre-recorded lectures or to this week's election. For my, that's not an issue for everyone's course. It was an issue for my course since I'm going to be teaching the course again next semester. So any of those things that were very timely, I would talk about during the course. And it worked out really well that way because the pre-recorded things would touch on broader concepts and theories. And then I could use what was going on in the real world to illustrate those things in the in-class portion. I'll talk more in a bit about the guests in the breakout room discussion. There were also discussion sections. Those were synchronous. I'm not going to talk about those right now. In terms of assessment, I've always given exams for this class, and I think they're pedagogically very useful. I decided not to do that this semester, though, just because it presented so many potential problems. So instead, I ended up giving them a series of essays, take-home essays to do during the semester. Now, in reality, these were very much the same sorts of essays that I would ask them on an in-class exam. It's just they had more time to do it and they could consult their readings and their notes and so on. Also, in terms of assessment, I gave a lot of points for a variety of activities. So there was, I thought it was important to give a broader set of possibilities for them to get points through. So they could get points for submitting questions about the pre-recorded lectures. They could get points for asking questions of the guests who came in. They could get points for asking questions about things I was talking about. In addition, I had them do reflections on each lecture. So after they watched the pre-recorded lectures, they had to hand in a set of questions. What did you learn from this? What did you have a question about? And what broader issues does it make you think about? For all of these things, I built in a big buffer, meaning that they could earn 3 points per reflection and they could earn a maximum of 30, but there were 15 of those. So they could have done the first 10 of them, gotten 30 points and been done with it. Or they could have taken some time off if they needed to during the semester. Okay, I can say more about all of those assessment things in Q&A. What I wanted to talk about now, though, is the 3 things that worked for me, whether through luck or design or probably a mixture of both, and that I'd like to share with you now. And I want to start by saying a little bit about where I'm coming from on this. I had a very basic background in using technology in class. I'm not a Luddite by any means in terms of using technology, but it's just not how I've taught this course or my other courses. And what do I mean by that? I knew Zoom existed. I knew Canvas existed. So those were good things. But I used Canvas very sparsely in the past, mainly as a way to post information. And so I was starting from scratch, and that worked for me with starting from scratch. The first, by far the most important advice that I would give, especially to someone who hasn't used a lot of do everything at once right at the beginning of the semester. There's some things you need to do in terms of the overall setup of the course, but for other things,
So Chuck, we're, I think, losing you, or you're going in and out. So I just want to let you know that. I don't know if it's me or if it's, no, we can't hear you now. Okay. I think we lost Chuck again. Yeah, I'm going to assume so for now. Okay. Yeah, so these are things that are part of this environment that we are working in. And there was a question in the chat I just saw about how do we avoid these things happening in class. And I don't think there's a way to avoid having these things happen in class. So it is about having flexible plans to be able to move between different kinds of things, including a game plan for you and your students about what the plan of action will be when these things happen, what the protocol is, especially if you are the one who ends up out the door, which is just as possible as the fact that your students might end up off the door. So I'm going to, our plan here was to turn to Q&A, and there have been questions here, and my colleagues, so Matt and Moni, we're going to begin posing some of the questions that have come in that haven't already been answered in chat. Please feel free to put additional questions in chat as we go along. There's a lot of folks on this call, so we're going to really rely on the chat to collect questions and then to pose them for discussion as we go along here. So Matt and Moni, I'm hoping you've coordinated for this next step.
Yeah, I'll start things off. Thanks, Deb. First of all, let me just compliment everyone on the amount of not only questions, but answers that have been posted into the chat. That's been a very lively discussion space and a nice example of a back channel that I think has been mentioned as a way students can ask and answer questions for each other. We wanted to start off by with a general sort of question, and I think this came up a little bit in what Meg and Katherine were saying, and that was talk a little. Who could talk a little bit about how changes in sort of your pedagogical attitude led to changes in the course. And I think, Katherine, you talked some about this, but Meg, you talked about, well, I just decided not to do this section, but what was the attitude there, and how did you come to terms with that, and how did that affect your teaching?
Yeah, I guess there were some things that I felt I had already been considering cutting. You know, we tried over time. You know, we've been trying to cut content. I think it's always hard for students to know that we actually have cut a lot of content because there's still a lot left. But we were trying, it did force me to think about what are the things that I really want students to still know or be able to do in 5 years. And we did asked our students at the end of the semester, we asked them specifically about that. And one of the things they said they appreciated about the course is learning how to tackle hard problems and how to work through things like that. And then because I teach biology, it's maybe not, it's relevant in a different way, I guess, than the political science course would have been. But we already had a full lecture on viruses and emerging infectious diseases, which was actually a little eerie to watch the recording of that lecture from last fall, where I talked about a totally new virus. What if it arrived on campus? And, you know, but so I did try also to focus in, like I did not want to cut anything about vaccination. I also didn't want to cut anything about human evolution and how there is not a biological basis for race, right? So when I was cutting, I was trying to think about what are some of the most important things for students to know. Climate change, that did not get cut, that got expanded, right? So really trying to think about what are some of the things that I think are absolutely essential for the students to know.
So you really started thinking about sort of takeaway goals as opposed to covering everything. Which
yes.
Do others have thoughts about this? Did this come up for other?
Well, I'll address. I think for me, the version of Meg's statement or Meg's thinking was, what do students need, and how can the humanities fill that need? Specifically, how can this course fill that need? Which then reoriented my allegiances to what it was I was teaching and how it was that I was teaching.
A more specific question that came up for you, Katherine, had to do with Slack and how you used it. And that seems unique for humanities. And so could you talk a little bit about how you used it? Did your teams use it? That would be helpful.
Okay. Well, I can show you. Actually, no, I think I'll just walk you through it. It was, well, since I can show animation. Here are the Slack channels for. This is for a senior seminar in comparative literature. So I have a channel for before class discussions, a channel for after class. This was just the introductory channel. Practical questions. So this is basically the announcement channel. And then random, which is where all sorts of fun stuff happened. And then as things developed, I added other channels. Students developing, these are all seniors, so they have research interests as the university, as we had the crisis of the university responding and not responding to COVID. We had a channel there to talk about that. I think the thing that was most useful about it was that you don't, in order to, it's instantaneous. So if I was sitting at my desk and a student wants to have an appointment and DMs me on Slack, I can just say, yeah, you want to talk to me right now? Drop in my office, I'll open the link, and it's done. Also, when somebody gets an idea, it's so much easier to post it on Slack, even if you're not doing it on your phone. I mean, I'm not attached physically to my phone, but many of us are. It's so much easier than firing up Canvas and going through all the pages and starting. No, you can just do it right there. And even the laptop application for Slack is extraordinarily fast and sleek. I know that there are other similar Slack-like items that the university has licenses to, and I talked to Moni about which one that I wanted to use one of those, and decided that actually the non-university affiliation of Slack for the kinds of class that I wanted to have was actually kind of nice. It's like, this is under the radar. Here's another thing about Zoom. You got to meet each other's pets. This is Little. She says hello to everybody. Actually, she doesn't, but has that answered the question?
Thank you very much.
So Chuck, we see you're back. Do you want to say the last few comments that you had about how you handled the guests and breakout rooms, a couple of things there, and then we'll come back to the Q&A.
Sure, I'm kind of afraid to try though. No, ironically, this didn't happen the entire semester. So the three things, I'll be very quick here. Starting simple, the way I talked about it to the students was this is going to be like a soft restaurant opening, that we're going to put a few things on the menu and then we'll reevaluate it next week. Maybe we drop the chicken dish and we add fish or something. The other thing I told them is that they should be patient and have a good sense of humor about all of this, which turns out to be very essential. So that's my first big piece of advice. My second is breakout rooms worked wonderfully. And I got a lot of great advice from people at CRLT and others in how to do this. I think it's really important if you're doing a big course and you have a synchronous component to do that. One way that I did it was they would watch the recorded lectures on something like, why do we have an electoral college, which many of us are asking. And then we would have breakout rooms to discuss what the alternatives were. In the breakout rooms, make sure to give them enough time to talk about these things. Make sure you and your GSIs pop into them. But I did that and they were really engaged in these discussions and liked the chance to be able to talk about it in real time. And then I would have them fill out a Google form where they would say which alternative they liked and why. I would get those, we would take a quick break, and then I would go through the spreadsheet that these all came into. I had asked each group to identify a spokesperson, and then I would turn to that spokesperson during class and have them weigh in, and then I could turn to other spokespeople also who had different points of view. It worked really well. I also did a mid-semester feedback thing where I asked students for ideas, much like we heard about earlier. And I got some great ideas for how to do breakout rooms in other ways. So I really advocate that. The final thing is having guests in was a wonderful idea. We have some very generous colleagues and former students here, and they have expertise on areas that I don't have as much expertise on. And I can easily teach any of these courses for an intro level course, topics for an intro level course. But there are people in my department who what they study is the media and politics. And I would ask them to come in very briefly, just name 3 points, 3 main things you've learned from your research and that you think an intro student would want to know. And tell a little bit about how you learned those things. So from that, the students learned a little bit about what sorts of questions political scientists ask and how they get research done. Then I would ask a couple questions to tie it to the class structure, and then I would open it up for student questions. And the students were amazing in terms of the questions that they asked. They did a great job in terms of asking things that the guests all said, wow, this is really terrific. So I didn't do that a lot. I did it once every week or two, but it really helped in terms of giving a variety of activities. Made it. Okay, back to you, Deb.
Thanks, Chuck, and super. And I'm so glad we got those examples in because they're I think, very helpful examples to hear of how you approach that. So I'm going to throw things back to Moni Dressler and to Matt Kaplan with other questions for the group.
So I really actually would like to hear a little bit more. You know, we had different people talking about assessment and the choices that you made to allow students to be able to, in some ways, be more creative, in some ways, be more prepared, and thinking about particularly, Dan, that giving students extra credit to create a study guide. Let's start with you. And how did you find that impacted the students' interactions in the class? Did it reduce their anxiety? Did it reduce the temptation for cheating? And is that something that you would continue to do in the future?
So you're asking specifically about study guides, and yeah. Well, in reference to study guides, I mean, I've done that for many years that I've taught this course. I typically don't allow students to use the study guides when we're in class, although like Meg, it's possible I'll change and do that in the future. But I did find that it helps more than anything to reduce anxiety by getting students to sort of study in advance. So the study guides are not due the minute before the exam happens. They're due a little bit in advance. And I do think that helps to reduce anxiety. So, I mean, I guess I'm trying to think, were there other creative activities you were asking about to reduce anxiety, or just study guides?
Can I can launch off of that. One of the reasons I switched to 6 exams from 4 was to try to reduce anxiety. And if a student took all 6 exams, there were several reasons why we changed, but if a student took all 6 exams, then the 2 highest ones get rescaled to be as like they're upweighted, and the 2 lowest ones are downweighted. And the dominant thing that students said they liked about 6 exams was it really reduced their anxiety, because they knew the stakes was lower for each of them, and then especially once you factored in the weighting. So they really, really liked that part. And definitely things being open note, open internet also reduced anxiety.
If I can weigh in on this from a slightly different perspective, one of the things that I did to reduce anxiety was to have a lot of smaller assignments throughout the semester. Submitting questions, submitting reflections about the lectures, doing assignments for discussion sections, having a series of essays. And I think all of this was a good idea. It did create a different sort of anxiety for the students, though, which is they felt like there were constantly things that they needed to be doing and thinking about. So I think for me, at least, I want to next semester sort of swing back the pendulum a little bit in having more assignments and more opportunities to get points than I did in the past, but maybe not quite as many as I did this semester.
Yeah, to add to that, also the workload for the instructors of doing 6 exams was a little ridiculous. There was one point in the middle of the semester where I was like, this is great for students and possibly lethal for instructors. So I think there are trade-offs. And yeah, some of the students were like, if I got a little behind, I just never had a chance to get myself caught back up.
Just to follow up on the good for students, lethal for instructors comment, I did Piazza this term for the first time, which is a large Q&A that students can ask questions on, and other students can answer or instructors can answer. And I think that reduced anxiety, because it wasn't like students had to wait for weekly office hours or something. They could just ask and get answers right away, and everybody could see them. Very efficient, actually, because the instructor doesn't have to answer like over email the same question from hundreds of students. You just answer it once. But it is a little lethal for instructors. My GSIs had to talk me off a ledge after the strike was over, because I got into this habit of answering everybody's questions because nobody was there except me, and just doing it immediately. So I was like staying up really late and just, and so after the strike was over, they were like, Daniel, just stop. You're not gonna, But I do think that increased my anxiety, but reduced the students' anxiety.
Daniel, sorry.
I will add to that and say that self-evaluation is, if you do it, and it probably matches up mostly with the kind of class that I teach, it is also not a labor saver. Don't do self-assessment if you want to have the burden of grading taken off you. What the burden it takes off is that terrible burden of, what do I do with this student? I know this student is suffering. How do I factor that into the grade? It removes that weight. And I was very grateful for that, but it does not reduce the instructor's work at all.
Daniel, there's a back and forth about student presentations. And I wonder if you could sort of bring that into the foreground here. It sounds like you use them. You might have used them in a lab section, it sounds like, because that was another question that came up, was how do people handle labs? So you want to jumpstart us?
Yeah, so in my course, it's a research methods course in cognitive neuroscience. And part of it involves the students reading primary journal articles in the field and giving a 10-minute presentation in pairs of in fact an article. So they have slides that they prepare in advance. We model it for them by actually giving a presentation ourselves over Zoom so they can see how it's supposed to look from an article that they read. And yeah, I mean, I think it worked really well. The students would share their screen and just go through the slides and divide up the presentation in half. And then there were lots of Q&A. So like after the presentation was over, either the GSI or the other students in the lab section or both would ask questions, and then the presenters would have to answer them. And that was actually part of their grade, that they had to show that they couldn't just memorize, some text and present it, but they could actually think on their feet about the material and answer difficult questions. But the students, I think, it varied. So some of the articles probably they found more interesting than others, but I think certainly for the ones that they really found interesting, there was a lot of engagement, and I think the students liked that.
Thank you.
Jump in with a question that we sort of wanted to pose to all of you. Several of you have mentioned the amount of work that's been involved, and Tim mentioned that in his opening remarks too, in terms of all of the work that both that has gone into this sort of remote term. I'm wondering if folks could talk a little bit at all about how you tried to manage that workload. I mean, mercifully you're all still here, so far maybe not totally lethal, but I'm wondering if you had any specific advice to give as people are finishing preparing for the winter term.
Okay, I'll start just because I'm unmuted and because I lack inhibition. Okay, so my advice would be do it all in advance. So for my course, I was working very hard over the summer to complete the Canvas site, to get everything, kind of up and running as best I could prior to the start of the semester. The only things I left to chance or that still need to be revised were maybe the quizzes and the exams, because I would create questions maybe in light of what I had said. But all of the content, all of the assignments, all of that stuff was already made. And I'm very thankful for that and all the help I got, because if I had to do that while I was teaching and while I was answering all those Piazza questions, I think it would have been very overwhelming. The second piece of advice I would have is that during the semester, I found, for example, that Piazza worked really well, that I didn't get duplicate emails, like people weren't emailing me anymore. And in the beginning of the semester, when occasionally somebody would, I would say, no, you have to ask this on Piazza, because I'm not going to answer you over email. And then they shifted and only emailed me about, I have to be absent or I'm sick or something. That was fine. But I would say that because I was using Piazza in particular, and the questions come in, I would set the timer. I eventually learned to set the timer so I only get it every 6 hours or something like this. And I would also learn, don't stay up late at night. If I get an email, I'm not going to answer it at 10 o'clock. No, I'm going to wait until the next day. And by then, sometimes a GSI or a student would answer. So I think for managing workload, I would sort of say that if you prepare really in advance, like all my lectures were completely prepared except the last one of the semester. So I think if you prepare everything in advance, that you can then do the semester in a kind of way that won't drive you crazy. There are still things that came up though during the semester. I was surprised. I had special accommodation students who needed closed captioning. I had all sorts of like kind of, things that were specific to online lecturing that were coming up constantly, like Canvas bugs or errors or things. So I needed extra time to deal with those. And that was the other reason why I think preparing in advance really helped. So those are my pieces of advice.
Thanks, Daniel. Does anybody else want to, Meg, do you want to address that, or anybody?
Yeah,
I
I mean,
different spaces here.
I have mixed feelings about this. So I spent a lot of July and August preparing, and that got the first half of the semester prepared. And I have mixed feelings about saying that because, I'm on a 9-month appointment and was not getting paid, and did an awful lot of work during that time, as did 2 lecturers in my department who were also working on it. The captioning, I mean, we knew that we always have students who need captioning, and it took a lot of time to get all of that worked out. And I was like super proud of myself because we use course packs. So we always do it in 2 halves, and we got the first half course pack posted by mid-August in case students needed it shipped. And the next day I had an email from a student asking when the second half course pack would be available. And I was like, oh my God, it's August. I will say we used Piazza several years ago in intro bio, and I would classify it as a complete disaster. So so I have an impression that maybe for some lower level courses, it doesn't, like, maybe there's a maturity component or something, that, they were using it for like polls on if they liked my lectures. It was just like, it was kind of ridiculous. So we had a different experience with Piazza. And I know other classes have too. It wasn't just our class.
So there's some discussion right now about handwritten exams, and actually, Meg, you were saying that you have done some of this because this is a real issue, particularly for the natural sciences that require any type of drawing, for mathematics, for problem solving, econ, statistics. There are a lot of fields that require something written by hand, and there are a variety of. There's in the discussion there are different people talking about things, but Meg, you had said that that you were planning on doing some training for the students. Can you just talk about what led up to that decision and how, what your hopes are that that will change and how it will be better?
Yeah, so we already this year, a change I was planning on making, even if we weren't having this sort of year, was making the discussion section the first week be more of a like how to do the course kind of discussion. And that worked really well. I think that helped students. And something we're going to add to it is how you take a picture and upload it and get it into Canvas, because students were having some problems for discussion assignments, right, where they had to draw out a cell at a particular part of the cell cycle. And many students were able to do it, but some students, I think it's easy for us to assume like, oh, all the students, they know all the technology, but they don't. Like I had a student email me yesterday to ask how you print only part of a PDF file, right? So like they don't know all these things that we might assume that they know. So we're going to just create a step-by-step guide of how you, with a phone, can take a picture and get it uploaded into Canvas in a way that then can be graded. Because part of the problem also was it was causing a lot of extra work for our GSIs, because a student would try to upload something and it wouldn't work, and the GSI would have to follow up. And so we're hoping if we train everyone in the first week, it'll save everyone a lot of time.
Moni,
Let me just add one more thing along those lines as just as a reminder and a hint to everyone, with the hand-drawn activities that particularly for instructors, we do have in technology services some document cameras available for checkout that you could take home for the semester. So if you do a lot of drawing in your lectures, or in your recordings, that you could do that from home, and that if you contact technology services, that's available. I also want to remind folks that you may choose to come to a classroom and use it as a studio, and technology services has links on their webpage, but you can always just email me and I'll get you connected to the right people, where then you could use the document camera and anything in the classroom to help do that. And similarly, if you have students who are particularly struggling with these things, our Blue Corps students are peer mentors who can walk students through some of this. So don't hesitate to include that Blue Corps information on your syllabus so that they can, so that students can access that. Sorry, Deb, Chuck had something he wanted to talk about?
Yeah, no, thanks for adding in those resources. We wanted to just throw it back to Chuck, who wanted to add in something about the managing workload. So I just wanted to circle back around to that.
Thanks, Deb. I want to give a slightly different perspective on this in terms of how much of the work you should do in advance. I think it really depends a lot on how familiar you are with all of the different options and technologies. I think if you're super familiar with all of these programs and all of the options and all of the things you can connect to it, then sure, go ahead. But it's an enormous amount of time to do that. I can also say that I attended a lot of workshops over the summer, and frankly, I found them overwhelming because they threw so many things at you. It wasn't just, here's how you can use Zoom effectively, or here's how you can use Canvas effectively. It went into very specific and detailed, and to my mind, very advanced sorts of topics that were way beyond where I needed to be. So I made the decision you have to have some structure in place, and it's gonna be an investment in time early on, and you have to do that. But I have friends here and at other places who tried to do everything over the summer, only to have everything collapse in the first 2 weeks because they were trying to do 12 different things. My advice for somebody who hasn't done a lot of this with technology in class, get the basics in place, and then you can add things. And then if things aren't working the way you think they are, you change it. So I changed the way students were submitting questions. I changed some of the things we did with breakout rooms. And that worked better for me. And it's the advice I would give to someone who hasn't done much of this before.
I just want to add one thing, because I actually think that's a great point. One thing that I did, although I said earlier that I worked very hard over the summer, like Meg reported, and didn't get paid. I'm also on a 9-month contract. So as most of us are. But one thing that I did was, in addition to attending these various workshops, the Department of Psychology paid graduate students to serve as instructional aides. And I was very fortunate to have an instructional aide assigned to me who had been a 7th grade teacher and who was a great GSI and really understood these different technologies. And so what happened was that I also felt overwhelmed by some of these workshops, but then I would go to my instructional aide and I'd say, well, I'm learning about this, how will this fit in? And she would say, oh, this is how we did it in this other course, or this is how I'm doing it here, or here's how I'd recommend, or just talk through the options with me. And I think having that sounding board and somebody who had that experience and knew kind of what my course was going to be like helped me to focus on the elements of the workshops that were going to be most useful for me. So anyway, that's just a tip. If you can find somebody like a consultant in your department who teaches a similar course, or another faculty or student member to work with, I think that could help.
So Daniel, thank you for raising that and mentioning that strategy. I think at this point, there have been a lot of things shared here, a lot of material and questions shared in the chat. I think at this point, I'm going to turn things back over to Tim Mckay. And Tim, you might want to say something also about resources that the college has made available to departments, but also sort of as we finish out here and think about any final words on preparing for winter.
You bet. Thanks much, Deb. It's great to have a chance to reflect on all this great stuff. I mean, so this bringing people together and letting them talk about their experience is so valuable. And I know that I have a bunch of notes to take out of this for my own thinking about all of these topics. Really great session. I hope we'll have an additional great session like this on Monday as well. There are so many ideas flying around. It's really, really exciting time. I will mention that there are, of course, always resources available to support what you need. There are not always all the resources you might like to have, but there are always resources. So as you think about what might help you as you're getting ready for the winter term, remember that groups like Lsna Technology Services have lots of both equipment and opportunity to support you in using that kind of technology. The college has made available to all departments and programs some funding to support development for the winter term. And we shared this with all of the department chairs and chief administrators, as much as $8,000 a department. And I say as much as, that's like nothing compared to the effort. I understand that, but it can be quite helpful. So if there's something that you would like to do that needs a modest amount of money, please speak with your department chairs about requesting that. And I will try to meet every single request that gets sent forward to me. So that, you should always ask. That's the bottom line about resources. So I'm gonna close out by just noting a few things that I really picked up in this conversation and trying to kind of amplify those. The first is that it's really obvious from both what we heard in the surveys and what we heard here today that connection is nearly everything. This is true even when we're together on campus, although we sometimes forget it. Design is an essential part of connection. So designing for good, humane connection is essential. If you don't design the course well, good intentions from the instructor are likely to fall short. But it isn't just design, and I think we heard that here today too. Delivery matters also. And a well-designed class could be undermined by a lack of commitment or instructor missteps along the way that kind of destroy the climate that you're trying to build. So they're both important. Katherine noted that, syllabus statements by themselves just don't do it, right? It's much more than that is required. Motivation and organization is also key for students, especially in large and complex classes. I heard several people use the phrase high structure classes. And I think particularly when you're teaching younger students, and especially when you're teaching younger students in large classes, structure is a really powerful tool for them. And it's a tool that works not only for the average student, but it's a very powerful tool for equity. If there are expectations you have or things that students should do, you have to help them know that. It's not enough to expect them to know that and then be disappointed when they do. I think that watching what has happened over the last year, watching everyone forced to change everything, has reminded us that successful teaching relies on basic principles of good and inclusive course design and delivery. Sometimes in the past, perhaps you, have felt stuck in structures that we know are not that inclusive. For example, being pressed by the expectations of students and our colleagues that we must cover all material in lecture, rather than using our time together in more active or responsive or interactive ways. Being expected to use large, high-stakes evening exams as our mode of evaluation, rather than thinking that we might try really new things, even if they're as simple as open note and open internet exams. And I heard this term recently that I'm really becoming fond of rigor theater. The idea that there are certain moves you must make to demonstrate what is considered rigor in the world. And an example is the expectation that if your class does not give out a lot of low grades, it must not be rigorous. I think the changes we've experienced have allowed us to upend some of those norms. It has also, as we've seen with asynchronous and synchronous questions, really helped us to rethink what we do in our time together and what we do on our own time. It has helped us to recognize again that there are no simple answers here, but there is some kind of spectrum. On one end, we have things which are always available and reviewable, usually things that are more like transmission of information, like books or recorded lectures, right? On the other end, there's something absolutely in the moment, open and active dialogue between individuals, informed by personal presence and body language, right? Stuff that can only happen in that mode. So there's some kind of spectrum, but we get a chance to rethink how we do some of the things in our classes, both in winter term and as we go forward from there. So the first goal at the moment, right, is to prepare for winter 2021 or another remote semester. And we know enough now, I think, to deliver quite a bit more effective online courses during the winter term. It is our third try at this point. But I want to leave you with the thought that we cannot forget that we're going to come out of this. And relatively soon. And when we do come out of this, we need to be sure to recover what was best from the time before, but also to fix as many of the problems we had in that prior time as we can, to keep the best of what we've learned in this COVID time, and also to imagine a future which is better than it ever was before. The upending we've experienced has created an opportunity to accomplish in a relatively short time more change than we've seen in the rest of our careers. I think this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for generational change. And I'm going to do everything I can to support those who want to make such changes. And I hope that you will be thinking about them during this period when we're still in a remote semester. We can be thinking about, what do we want to look like, feel like, what do we want to do as we emerge from this? If there's something you've given up that you don't want to go back to, I don't want to see us go back to it just because that's what we used to do. So you get my point. I look forward to having another one of these conversations on Monday. I want to thank you all for being here, and especially thank the CRLT and Lsna Technology Services staff that put this together, and of course our wonderful panelists. It's so exciting to see all the different ideas that have emerged, and to see that some of those ideas come directly from students. That's always great. So thank you very much. I hope you all have a great weekend, and as we get toward the holiday, that you can begin to finally unwind, recharge yourself, and be ready in the middle of January when we come back together again. So thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.